This is Rocky Snyder. At the tone, leave your name and message and I'll get back to you.
Hey, Rock. It's Jeff Moreno from PWR Lab. Hey, man, I got some time. The Olympics have been canceled, and I'm ready to rock. Let's do it.
On today's show, we have Jeff Moreno, a physical therapist and board-certified orthopedic clinical specialist. Jeff became the team physical therapist for Nike Team Run Los Angeles, a post-collegiate professional running team. He's helped U.S., Canadian, Mexican, and Chinese track and field champions, as well as Olympic and World Championship medalists, be their best self. He founded Move to Thrive in 2015 and is also a founder of PWR Lab. Now, he takes his knowledge of sport and athletic development and combines with technology to empower athletes toward healthy, sustainable individual performance. Help me welcome Jeff Moreno onto the show. Jeff, tell me about PWR Lab. I know you're a big component and definitely a huge part of this, but it's just starting, it seems, to make it to the front edge. What, first of all, is PWR Lab, and what do you guys do there?
Yeah, so PWR Lab represents preparedness, wellness, and resiliency, and if I think probably stepping back a tiny bit and just kind of giving you a little bit of a story that will help set this stage of why we created this in the first place, and so I think I'm a physical therapist by trade. I tell people that I'm a confused physical therapist because I never really fit in the confines of that setting very well. I came from a very athletic background. Parents were coaches, extended family were coaches, and PE teachers as well. So I always had a very active childhood. And then one thing led to another, going to school, and wanted to continue that process, and thought, well, shoot, had a surgical intervention when I was young, and I was introduced to physical therapy, and I thought, man, I love watching people move, and I love sport, and if I can combine this in a profession that was physical therapy, this would be amazing. So I went down that route, but as I continued that route and really, again, grew to love that whole process, I found myself questioning kind of the big picture. And I had a hard time, and I grappled with the idea that the only time I get to see individuals was after they were already hurt and in pain. But a lot of their risk factors for those injuries, sporting injuries or what have you, were well apparent prior to the onset of them complaining of the symptom, right? And so I thought it was just backwards. Our healthcare system, to me, was just backwards, and the only time I can access them was after the fact. And I just thought, well, can't we do this in a different way? Can't we be more proactive in someone's health? And so this was around, probably around 2011 or 12. And around that time, I'd been really immersed in the running world, and I'd been traveling internationally and working with national governed bodies of different nations, and lecturing on athlete development within the United States and outside of the United States. And one guy in 2012 stopped me during a lecture and said, man, all this great stuff that you're saying about the importance of movement and health and what have you, and running. And he said, how much of this are you going to be speaking about in the next 15 to 20 years? And at that time, I was struggling with these questions of, man, why are these people, why do I have to wait to treat someone? why can't I be proactive in someone else's life? Why are these kids coming into me with so much dysfunction? And what's wrong with the greater global just ecosystem or environment that young athletes are growing up in that result in injuries not getting, the incidence of injuries just growing, even though we know so much, right? More than we ever have. And I sat there and then I answered him honestly. I was like, you know what? You're right, man. I probably am going to be talking about the same exact stuff. What I didn't know at the time, this guy became a really good friend of mine. His name's Scott Anderson, who was at Stanford University at the time. He was just finishing up a 4-year study of all their incoming Division I athletes, freshmen coming into the university, and they would do pre-participation examinations on them. And what he was finding is that before they even entered the university, they already had lost about 260 years of lost practice time due to injury. And there's a cohort of about 1,400 athletes that they studied over 4 years. A group of them already had almost an average of 2 surgical interventions prior to coming into the university. And these kids haven't even had 1 practice at Stanford yet. And so, many of them would go on and have maybe 1, if not more, surgical interventions over the course of their intercollegiate career. And so we got together, and then me and 2 other guys got together, and we said, well, man, there has to be a better way, right? We can't just triage and just put Band-Aids on everybody all the time. Something bigger is going on. And so it started with that. It started with the understanding that if someone is going to perform, and performance is individual to everybody, whatever that means to that individual, we need to understand that health is intimately coupled with performance, and you can't have one without the other. And so these individuals, young kids at the time, or adults or runners, were trying to do what they love to do and show up the next day. But if you're not available to train, you just can't get better. It's impossible, right? And so then not only is that a physical thing, but it's also a psychosocial thing. And those are intimately connected, as we well know. So that took me on a very long rabbit hole for more than a year. And eventually came to the point, well, I need to take this information and knowledge that I have in the running world and really devote my life in a way that I can help try to solve this problem. The problem is really simple. The problem is that as many as 79% of runners in a given year have some sort of injury.
Isn't that amazing? 79%.
And that's just one. Some people have multiple, right? And we know, some other statistics that, 90% of runners trying to train for a marathon end up sustaining at least one injury during that training cycle. But we also know something really interesting, and this was a study done out of Australia in 2015, that I call it the 80% times equals 7 times. And what that means is that if we can get runners just to show up and be available to train 80% of their training, they have a 7 times likelihood of increasing, or a chance of increasing their performance goals. So it's not rocket science. The idea of running, and I'll break this down even further into things that we prioritize, is getting people to understand that most of training and most of injuries occur as a result of a training error. And approximately 70% of those injuries are a result of training error alone, which means that, yeah, they may have some biomechanical inefficiencies, and, everybody, we don't even know what optimal is, but most, people don't have to be perfect to be healthy and run. But if you add bad training onto that, and you add poor programming, and you haven't earned the right to do something that you're trying to do, your chances of getting injured are pretty high, as we know. So we took that and we said, okay, if we can't see everybody, if not everybody can go see Rocky and get things looked at physically and manipulated and guided in a direct, what is the low-hanging fruit that we can pull on to help facilitate a better chance for individuals showing up tomorrow and showing up each week and showing up each month and showing up each year more consistently? And so we took that idea and we said, well, let's take data that people collect every single day, utilize that data, low friction data, and repurpose it in an actionable, accessible, and achievable way that is not rocket science. We take the complexity of it and drive simplicity for individuals. And so that's what we're doing. And we're prioritizing people programming or people's training program in a more appropriate way. We're prioritizing lifestyle. We have some basic biomechanical things that we look at. And then we're really developing access. And I call this the 4 C's. And if anybody, and you don't need our program or anybody's program to actualize these 4 C's. And the 4 C's really start with consistency. Just show up, man. Like if it's 10 minutes, 5 minutes, like you don't have to overachieve. One thing we realize, and one thing we're understanding is it's almost not good to overachieve early on. And if you can just show up and be consistent with your training, show up 3 days a week, facilitate positive behaviors and habits that allow you to successfully grow that over time, good things are going to happen. So that's 1 C. The second C is correctly load. And this is where our magic is trying to figure out, with everything that you've done in the past, have you earned the right to do what you're trying to do now? And if not, how do we get you to get there safely? And so that's huge for us.
Do you find that most people load too quickly, too much, too soon?
Yes, and yes. And so, but we also believe that it works both ways. So sometimes in our system, we tell people that they're not loading enough. And in the gym, I actually think that, and this is because I'm a confused physical therapist, I have the ability and the right to bag on physical therapy a little bit.
Okay. In the only one. I work in a good company here.
Yeah, in the physical therapy world, we never load people enough. And it's that lack of load that doesn't stimulate enough of an adaptation to allow them to get where they want to go over time appropriately. And so I think we do a disservice to a clientele partially based on how our healthcare system's set up, and we don't prioritize it enough. Unlike you, Rocky, or other groups or individuals who that's not only movement is a big deal, and the quality of movement and physical literacy is a big deal, but you're also loading the system up in order to meet the demands of the event, right? And in running, that's as much as 2.5 to 5 times your body weight, depending on the speeds that you're running at, right? So, and at the calf, it's as much as 9 times your body weight. So that's a huge deal. So that brings me to the third C. And if you have the first two C's, which is consistency and correct loading, then the third C kind of takes care of itself, which is capacity. And that capacity will grow progressively over time as you continue to evolve and adapt. And people, and I would say physios, don't allow and facilitate high enough capacities to deal with the demands of the sport being running. So that's a big one. And then the fourth one is a little more softer. And there's a little less quantitative data around this, but it's important for me, is what I call control, or controlling the moment. I'm really interested in people paying attention to the system that they inhabit, which is their mind and their body. And I love data, but I also know that technology is taken our ability to do this away from us over time. And so we have individuals come in, and you know this really well, Rocky, where they just don't have a sense of anything about their body, good or bad or indifferent, right? And bringing awareness back to them and getting them to control or listen to how they feel and then act appropriately is really important.
Yeah, I definitely can attest to that. In fact, being in the outskirts of Silicon Valley, we'll have a large number of clients working in the tech field. And it's that group that struggle the most to have a physical connection with their body on average, just because they're so cerebral and they're so, for the most part, physically disconnected with their body while they're at work. So, you know, talking about the 79% of runners are going to have some type of issue in the tissue, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for me, how I look at that is that the more technologically advanced we become, the less overall activity the human frame is going to go through, and therefore the specific adaptations to impose demand, the said principle, is going to tell us that our frames are going to devolve in a way or weaken the structure. And then we take that frame and we go and try and offset our sedentary lifestyle with activities such as running. But running, in terms of the mechanics of running, is something that should be incredibly efficient, requiring very little energy to maintain or sustain for long distances at a time. But now we're doing this with compromised structures. And so that's how I see a whole bunch of these maladies coming into play. And then add to that, like you say, the training programs that are being created in the common gym setting, or even in the training studios with quote unquote qualified professionals. Where are they getting their information to create the programs? Well, it's fundamentally in three competitions historically within the gym. You've got bodybuilding, which is nothing about running, but merely about the aesthetics of a human form, the definition and the size of the muscles or hypertrophy. Then you've got powerlifting, which is just squats, deadlifts, and bench press, which is all about force production in the muscle, and that has nothing to do with running necessarily. And then you've got Olympic style weightlifting, which is now explosive vertical displacement of force, which also doesn't really have anything to do with ambulation and moving through space with locomotion, running, walking, or whatever. So that's the pillar of most training programs. And runners are doing these exercises expecting this beautiful carryover to occur. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely accurate. And I think if you look over the course of history, one of the things, I mean, you know, obviously I own a tech company, so I love innovation to a certain degree. However, with innovation comes less labor, right? And so what would normally have occurred back in the day, and people outside producing some form of movement as a result of the need to labor, lift, push, pull, throw, no longer happens, right, on a regular basis. And nowhere is this more of a problem than with our kids, right? And so with the running population, if I were to bring it back to that specifically, like I said, you go from sitting all day in a relatively static, probably less than optimal position, obviously, to a dynamic activity that requires coordination and timing at 3 times your body weight, single leg over time and distance at a given speed, right? And that is a big problem. That's like rolling dice, and it's a ticking time bomb, right? And so, and that's why if you look across all types of injuries in all populations, things are not getting better. They're either getting worse or they're status quo. And it's not because we don't know more. It's because, when you have an environment or an ecosystem that isn't conducive to the natural development of a human, and then those two things collide and we have some major issues. If I were to break it down into 4 things, because I love buckets, as you probably have figured out. And I talk to it in regards to runners. I'm looking at 4 kind of buckets in terms of things that they should be aware of and be doing outside of just running alone. And one of those buckets I call flow. And flow is like a time for them to discover their body through movement. And it may be less specific to the sport, but it's important for the human to do just in general. So that may be, runners don't look like they're deep squatting when they're running, but it's important to be able to go through large bandwidths of motion within the hip, knee, joint, and ankle, right? And we know with individuals that most individuals lack just good talocrural joint mobility and hip mobility as a result of the confines of our environment, right? And so flow is really about just rediscovering movement in a different way. And some people that may look like a core activity, some people that may look like a mobility session, but it's really individual to them. And it's for them to discover that through maybe someone like you yourself, Rocky, or someone like myself, or that they need to help, which is really important. The next one is capacity. I think when we talk about earning the right to perform or earning the right to do what you're trying to do, capacity is an important thing. And so most people think of that as strength, and they can look at that as strength. For a runner, it means learning how to lift really heavy with low repetition, knowing that you aren't going to bulk up that way because there's an interference effect based on the amount of work that you're already doing within running. But it's important for the tissue to be able to withstand the tolerance and the demand of the sport that you're trying to do, which is hit the ground really hard over time and distance, right? This creates a stiffness that we like, not a muscular stiffness, but or a stiffness is in mobility, but a stiffness is in a spring. We want a stiff spring when we hit the ground. And that brings me to the next phase, which is what I call tuning. And tuning is about facilitating those springs, and which allow for efficiency and coordination and timing. And this may look a little bit more specific to running. And then most importantly is what I call vital signs. And vital signs have to do with your sitting down and shutting the system off and reducing sympathetic drive to the system. We live in a world that is like full tilt all the time. The more is better. Less sleep is better. All that drives our nervous system in a negative way, which then in turn can create a lot of pain for some people, or emotional distress, or for our high performers, reduce performance. So, and none of that actually was running, I just talked about, but all of it has to do with running.
Sure.
And just health in general. So that's what I would totally agree with you on all those things.
Well, what's interesting is I hear you saying also is that, yes, running, amazing as it is in terms of training, you don't necessarily just need to run to be a better runner. There are the opposite components, whereas running is a contralateral movement, one arm swinging forward, opposite arm swinging back, and vice versa for the legs. So that kind of patterning has been reinforced with every repetition for thousands and thousands of training miles. But doing a squat, which is a bilateral action, both legs doing the same thing, not the opposite thing at the same time, is a nice way of kind of shocking the system, giving it an alternative movement. In the same light, running is a very sagittal plane action primarily, forward, backward action, flexion, arm swinging, leg swinging back and forth. And we can also propel force forward through rotation. So secondarily, the next plane would be the transverse plane for rotation. Both of those movements, sagittal and transverse plane, can create force production or movement forward and back. The one plane of motion in this three-dimensional space that cannot do that, that does not do that, is the frontal plane. So it's no wonder when we see people that are avid competitive or recreational runners come in and see us, they are typically not the most flexible people on the planet. And could it be because they are very linear in their movement? One of the areas that they are the most restricted, you'll probably attest to, is the frontal plane. So in order for them to achieve greater performance and reach a more optimal level of running, we actually do a lot of side-to-side or lateral action with them to free up their ability to move cleanly through the frontal plane. And in so doing, it has a tremendous carryover into the other two planes of motion. So with Power Lab, you mentioned that there are certain metrics that everyone is accumulating.
Yeah.
Take that information, extrapolate a whole bunch of layers of data and information to better gauge a person's training protocol, volume, duration, intensity, and so on.
Yeah.
What is it? What elements are we talking about? Is it just simply heart rate, or is it something dealing with Strava or some other phone?
Yeah. So so here's a device right here. We take just a GPS watch, and most people who run consistently have something like that, like a Garmin or a Polar or a Suunto, and that watch accumulates a lot of data second by second, and some of it is heart rate, and some of it is basic stride characteristics, like cadence or stride length or flight time, and velocity in terms of speed. And we take all that information. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to understand initially where someone's baseline, or what do we call their floor, is. So they come in, we pull all their information second by second, historically, if they have any. And that can be multiple years, or it can be months or days. And we take that information and we deeply try to understand who they are individually as a runner from a load standpoint. So we look at their volume, their intensity, their frequency and their density of movement. And then we calculate uniquely to Power Lab their power output per step, which is a component of intensity. And then we break that up into what we call their critical power, which is just a fancy term for like a threshold mark, a point at which they, if they go too much over, they fall off the edge, so to speak, and they become significantly less efficient. And then we take that information, and then we're able to deeply understand their risk, relative risk of injury based off of that information. There's also very basic stride characteristics that help to inform us and this is what we're working towards, patterns of movement. And those patterns of movement then in turn can inform us what their potential risk for is in certain buckets. So for example, like someone who may be more susceptible to a knee injury based on their age, their training history, the type of basic stride characteristics they have, or someone may be more susceptible to a lower leg injury based off of the data they're showing. And then we simplify that. All that's super complex. And then we simplify that down even more to just a red, yellow, and green light that says, hey, you're doing great. You've earned the right to do what you're trying to do tomorrow. Go for it. Or yellow, hey, you're on the edge. You're still doing great. You've earned the right to do this, but I want you to pay attention and control the moment. And then red, you're really about 2 to 4 times increased risk of potential injury, more than your baseline. For the next 7 to 14 days, you better chill out. You better cool your jets a little bit. And then we created a forecasting tool that allows them to go into the future and say, here's what I want to do. I want to run 5 miles tomorrow or the next day. If I did that, would I still be in the red, or would I be in the yellow, or would I be in the green? And so then it gives them control and autonomy to facilitate a positive behavioral response or a reduction in their potential risk. So that forecasting tool is kind of our secret sauce. Is like we give the individual the ability and the power to make a positive decision based on all of their information to date.
I know that within some of these running apps and cycling apps for that matter, even surfing apps, it'll show you what your length or distance traveled is, your average speed, your peak speeds, time allotment, all that stuff. But what you're saying is, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but there's other metrics that are not as well known that are within the programming that maybe the average user is not familiar with. So you're actually tapping into the underbelly of all of what's being measured in a person. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so what I found really interesting is when I would get information from a data standpoint from these apps or these companies, that it was cool, it was awesome, but it really didn't help me to make a decision on what I was going to do tomorrow based on my health and my performance. It's cool to know, and we give that to people. It's cool to know, hey, you ran 6.7 miles at a velocity at a pace of 630 per mile pace. You climbed 500 feet in elevation, and you had a power output of 410 watts. That's cool, and we show that stuff. But what I'm really interested in for individuals is I'm really interested in connecting health to performance, right? And making sure that they show up tomorrow, and that the information that we're giving them is not just more data that is never used, but that it's used in a way that's actionable, that facilitates a positive response tomorrow.
So with Power Lab, just going to their website, I see you've got a wide range of athletes that you're working with: Olympians, professional athletes, international athletes, but you also have just your fitness enthusiasts, shall we say, your running enthusiasts, right?
Yes, and I think there's a big misconception out there that it must be different for a professional athlete. Well, I'm here to tell you that it isn't. They're trying to do this. They're trying to figure out how to stay healthy just as much as a recreational athlete is trying to figure out how to stay healthy. They may run faster. They may run more miles. They may get paid for this crazy sport that they do. But it's all the same. It's really in principle not different. And so we were just now kind of the proof of concept was more of these higher performers, and these professional or Olympic level or world championship level athletes, collegiate athletes. But now we're bringing that down to just the general population, because everybody deserves the opportunity to just have control over their running health. And that's how we look at it. And it's for everybody.
So let's just say there's some people listening to this, watching along, and they're just avid runners, and they, whether or not have chronic bouts of running related injuries or issues, or they have yet to experience it, how can they utilize Power Lab? What are the steps to take?
Yeah. So the first step is really simple, and it's initially free. And here's also how I think of it is you go to the website, or you download the app to the iPhone or Android. If you are wearing a GPS enabled device, you connect that device to our platform. That device, it only needs to be connected once, and it's really easy. It pulls in all your information, and it will pull all your information in for the foreseeable future. Once we have that, then you connect to the platform, you put in your login, all that kind of stuff, and then whammo, you're on board and you're rocking.
Great to see what trends start to occur, not only for this 2-month period of shelter in place. Obviously, it's going to be a very short window of data that you're going to be getting, but I just mean in the long term, with all the runners that are right now because of it.
Yeah, we're going on 74 billion points of data right now that we've already collected. And so, we have a pretty good data set, and it's growing, and it's all over the world. If you name a country, we have a runner in that country. And it's pretty amazing. And we're just a small company from a small part of California in Santa Cruz, like yourself, trying to do things to help people. So, yeah. And I also want to say to you, Rocky, that our community is massively lucky to have someone like you in our community. Everybody should be jealous that they don't have a Rocky in the community, which I'm sure they do. So
I appreciate that. I'm just glad to know you, and where we can get some time together and chat a little bit about what you've been doing and how it hopefully can help throngs and throngs of wannabe and professional Olympic athletes themselves. Well, I want to go through 2 movements that relate to what Jeff and I were talking about in our session, and that is pursuing movement along the frontal plane. If you recall, we can run by driving our body forward and backward, obviously, along the sagittal plane, but there's also a good deal of rotation. I can send my body forward or backwards simply by rotating. It's that lateral action that doesn't propel us forward. It merely allows us to get over to one leg and propel over to the other leg. And provided those muscles are lengthening and shortening in the proper way and the joints are moving the way they should, well, you'll have no problem with your run. However, for most runners, that is an area that gets very restricted. So, right to it. We're going to give you 2 movements that could help to improve your running efficiency, reduce the likelihood of injury, and actually give you more energy on your run. You'll just need a step, maybe a box, or just your average stairs going up to the 2nd story of your house, or whatever the case may be. I'm going to place one foot on the step, and I've tucked my shirt in so you can kind of see the waistband here. And what I want to do is I'm going to bend into the knee that's on the step, and as I do so, I'm going to feel the weight of the dangling leg that's off the step descend down until the foot comes down to the ground. This knee is just going to maintain its position as it bends over the front of my foot there. And what I'm really trying to focus on is, can I get that hip here to drop down? In essence, as that drops, this one hikes. That lengthens and loads the gluteal muscle and drives me back to a more level or neutral position. So this is, in some ways, a really great glute exercise. But it's doing much more than that. It's teaching the body and the joints how they should behave. I can encourage this by taking the arm of the dangling leg side and reaching upward to pull the rib cage away from this hip, further lengthening the tissue between both regions. And of course, you can do the same thing to the other side. What we're really trying to do is, can we initiate this hiking and dropping the pelvis to lengthen and load that whole gluteal complex, which is the biggest muscle of the body and what should be propelling you. But how many runners do you know that are weak back here? They rely on their quads, their hip flexors, their calves, their hamstrings, and the biggest muscle out of the entire body is left out of the party. So it's time to invite them back in. Okay, that's the first one. What we'll do next is have some space to move laterally. Imagining that you're on a clock face with 12 in front of you, 6 behind you, your right leg is going to step out to 3 o'clock, then your left leg will step out to 9 o'clock. And what we're hoping to do here is create more abduction and adduction of the hips themselves, meaning pulling the body away from one leg toward one other leg. And then I'll come over to the other side. This we can call a lateral lunge. And with this lateral lunge, I'm going to encourage both feet to stay pointing straight ahead. And when this foot hits the ground, that sole is flat, but so is the other trailing foot, the one that's not going anywhere. While this knee is flexing and the hip is flexing and bending into this loaded position, I'm going to encourage this knee to stay extended. If you have muscle tissue in the inside of your thigh, we'll call the adductors, that are restricted, what you might find is when you do the lateral lunge, this knee is instinctively going to want to bend. And that is to reduce the intensity of the lengthening of that tissue inside that inner thigh. So be attentive to your movement. Make sure that knee is extending as you load onto that side. I can encourage even more length by driving my arms and torso in a certain direction, also sideways. However, I'm going to drive them in the opposite direction that I'm traveling. In this case, as I take my left leg out to my left, I'm going to take my arms and glide sideways to the right, and then come back up to center, step across with my right leg to the right, and lean my arms and torso to the left. Beware that when you do this, that there isn't any kind of turning or torque or rotation. We're really looking for as clean of a sideways motion, that lateral action, as you possibly can. If you're restricted in your lateral action, do not be surprised if you find yourself subconsciously wanting to rotate or lean forward or lean backwards to try and get away from your restrictions. Try those two movements out. Incorporate that into your pre-run kind of warm-up, and then see how your next run is after that. Did you feel lighter on your feet? Was there more efficiency in your movement? Did you have more energy? Did you just feel happier? You should be a happy runner. You should always be smiling when you're running outside or whether you're on a treadmill. It shouldn't be something that you're dreading. If it is, you might want to rethink what it is you're doing. Until next time, try these movements out, shoot me an email or put a comment below the video. Let me know how it goes. All right, all you runners, I hope you enjoyed the show, and be sure to tune in next week when our guest is Coach G.P. Perlberg, not only a running coach for the Boomer Esiason Foundation, but also author of Run Tall, Run Easy. We'll see you then.